Good morning, everybody. Youssef introduced me earlier. I'm Chris Rowe. I'm a PFM advisor on the Pearl ARC program. Allow me to stand on existing protocols. We had an interaction with Adamawa state officials in late 2018 in Abuja, and we gave a number of presentations around the MTEF process, around budget planning and budget preparation. So that was our first opportunity to interact with Adamawa state government officials. It was a very useful session, and today really we are building on that. We will repeat summarized presentations from that session, and then we will move into a practical application looking at the 2021 to 2023 MTEF. Before I start with the presentation, I would like to congratulate Adamawa State. We sent a list of data, historical fiscal data requirements about 2 weeks ago, and I was very impressed with how quickly Adamawa State were able to return that data and even provide it for a longer time period than we asked for. This data you will see as we go into the practical sessions. It's very important to provide us context around prior fiscal performance, as well as being used to do some of the forecasting for future revenue and expenditures. So I was going to ask individuals to raise their hands to indicate who we have in this session that was in the workshop in Abuja in 2018. But since we're having some challenges, I won't ask that, but if anybody was there and can put into their chat box that they were there, it would be useful to know who in this session has already been exposed to these videos, to these presentations. So I will now move to the first presentation, which is an overview of the MTEF process. Okay, so first of all, what is the MTEF, or the Medium-Term Expenditure Framework? The MTEF is a transparent medium-term, and this typically means 3 years, planning and budget formulation process, within which government establishes credible contracts for allocating public resources to their strategic priorities, whilst also ensuring aggregate fiscal discipline. The process entails 2 main objectives. These are setting fiscal targets, and these fiscal targets will define our aggregate revenues and expenditures, and allocating resources to strategic priorities within these targets. So that effectively is allocating resources to sectors and to MDAs. So the allocations to strategic priorities require determination of government-wide priorities by the Cabinet, which is, of course, at the state level, the Executive Council, and looking at portfolio-wide priorities by ministries. These allocations have to take into consideration existing commitments, existing expenditures, and existing capital projects, as well as new policy priorities that the state wants to introduce. Transparency requires that the priorities of EXCO are explained in what is called a budget policy statement, whereas the priorities of individual ministries are then explained in their medium-term sector strategies. The MTEF has 3 main components, and in the next slide we will look at this. It's sometimes easier to see it in a diagrammatic presentation, so the next slide we will show you that. But effectively the 3 elements of the MTEF are the medium-term fiscal framework. So this includes the fiscal objectives and targets, and estimations of the aggregate revenue and expenditures for the state over a 3-year period. What we'll see in our practical session is that this fiscal framework is linked to a macroeconomic framework. The macroeconomic framework defines some of the higher level targets and forecasts for things like GDP, inflation, and also the crude oil benchmarks, which provide very important framework for statutory allocation forecasts. Secondly, we have what's called the medium-term budget framework. So this effectively takes the aggregate resources from the fiscal framework and divides them up between sectors in order that sectors can then update their medium-term plans. And this brings us on to the third element, the medium-term sector strategies. So this is the bottom-up preparation of strategies, programs, projects and activities, which should of course be costed over the 3-year period. So here we have the 3 elements, the MTFF, the fiscal framework, the MTBF, the budget framework, and the MTSS's medium-term sector strategies. As I said, this is often easier to see in a diagrammatic format. So here we can see the top-down elements, the aggregate resource envelope, the fiscal framework. So this, sometimes we consider this as a pie or a cake. So what this does is it defines how big our pie is. And then once we know how big our pie is, we can chop it up, we can carve it up and give a piece of the pie to each sector. The sector then takes their slice of the pie and divides it into a number of programs, projects, and activities, which will then be included within the annual budget through their annual budget submissions. One thing that's very important to note is that the MTEF is not just a set of figures, a set of numbers. For all of the estimates and for all of the allocations, there has to be some narrative which justifies and explains the decisions. These are laid out in the fiscal strategy paper, the budget policy statement, and the medium-term sector strategies themselves. If you look in the top left-hand side of this diagram, we have what's called the economic and fiscal update. So this is a very important first step. It's a backwards-looking review of prior economic and fiscal performance. When we're forecasting into the future, it's always very important to consider what has happened in the past, where have we performed well, where have we not performed well, what are the trends in our IGR, our expenditures. These will help inform and actually help us forecast into the next 3 years. Here we have another diagram. Sorry, I'm just trying to move some of the... Okay, here we have another diagram which helps to show how the MTEF process links into the annual budget process and also linking to the strategic development plan. What we can see here is if we look in the middle column, apologies. If we look in the middle column, we can see the MTEF process, and in the right-hand column, we can see the annual budget processes. So the budget policy statement will feed directly into the core circular, and the costed MTSSs will feed directly into the annual budget submissions by MDAs. So the MTEF process is not a standalone process. It has to be very closely linked to the annual budget. It has to inform the key stages of the annual budget in order that it has influence and is effective in ensuring government's policy priorities are reflected in budgetary allocations and actual expenditures. Preparing the MTEF takes some resource within the state, and some time. So we have to understand, why are we preparing it? Why is it important? The MTEF provides revenue and expenditure forecasts over the 3-year period and defines decisions around sector level allocations and ensures they are clearly linked to policy priorities. Both the Executive Council and the State House of Assembly should be involved in reviewing and agreeing the MTEF, because it again defines the following stages in the budget process: the call circular, the envelopes in the call circular, and the submissions by line ministries. Why do we want to budget on a multi-year perspective? A lot of our capital projects and broader programs within the MTSSs will take several years to implement. If we consider building a bridge, or building a significant stretch of new road, or building a hospital, the process of actually building these, contracting a contractor, building it, reviewing it, ensuring that it is being built to specification, and making payments to the contractor will often take more than 1 year. And therefore it's important that we have a framework which recognises those commitments into out to years. Linked to this, many capital projects will require operation and maintenance costs into the future. Again, if we consider building a hospital, we will then have to provide staff, we will have to provide goods and services, medicine, etc. So in building a hospital, we are committing ourselves into future years to provide operation and maintenance personnel costs to actually achieve the benefits of that hospital. Let's look at the individual parts of the MTEF, the fiscal framework first. So as I said, the fiscal framework includes aggregate estimates of revenue and expenditure. The revenues are often forecasted by using macroeconomic framework items like the crude oil benchmarks. We'll look at this in more detail in the next presentation. Within the fiscal framework, we would also anticipate seeing a number of reserves, like a planning or contingency reserve. We would also look at our fiscal deficit and our borrowing requirements. Again, we will see all of this when we get to the practical sessions. We will see what this looks like in the flesh in our practical sessions. The fiscal strategy paper, within which the fiscal framework is contained, provides the narrative, provides the justification, so that our MTEF is not just a set of figures, it's not just the numbers, it provides the assumptions, the targets, the policy statements that define the figures in the fiscal framework. Very importantly, we also have to identify any major fiscal risks. So fiscal risks are things that will impact our revenue and that will impact our expenditure. A very real fiscal risk that has occurred this year and that has impacted us is the COVID-19, which has had a multitude of impacts on our revenues. So we've had a reduction in crude oil price, we've had devaluation of the Naira, and we've had to increase expenditures to react to the health and social crisis. Obviously, this time last year, we did not know about COVID-19, but we know our dependence in a lot of instances on Federation accounts. So any risks that may impact that have to be taken into consideration. And when we identify a risk, we have to then identify what is the impact if that risk occurs, how can we mitigate it, and how can we avoid it. The medium-term budget framework and budget policy statement. So this is the second element of the MTEF. So the state should have a clear statement of expenditure policy priorities. This would usually be based on the manifesto of government. What did the current administration promise when it was elected in, I'm not sure if Adamawa is within the, I think it's within the usual cycle. So in 2019, what did the current administration promise they were going to do as part of their election manifesto. The budget policy statement provides allocations to sectors, and it can provide allocations for personnel, for overhead, for capital, or it can make aggregate allocations, and sectors are able to decide how they spend their money between personnel, overhead and capital. The nature and the structure of this budget policy statement and the figures needs to be determined and discussed with the state. We've mentioned sectors a lot, and there is sometimes some confusion as to what is a sector. If we consider the National Chart of Accounts, the National Chart of Accounts defines 5 sectors: administrative, economic, judicial, social, and regional. But these are not sectors that we would make plans on. Within social sector, we would obviously look at health, education, women, youth and sport, potentially other areas. Within administrative, we have finance, we have broader administrative areas. Within economic, we potentially have infrastructure, water, other areas. So it's important that when we think about sectors, we don't confine ourselves to the definition of sectors in the NCOA. We have to consider about how we define sectors within our state. Okay, I will now hand over to Dr. Gabriel, who will talk us through the third element of the MTEF, which is the MTSSs.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for the presentation, and especially for bringing out this issue of the definition of sectors by National Chart of Accounts and vis-a-vis the planning, state development planning and budget. This is one thing that the Adamawa State team we encounter when they start developing the MTSS. They will see that the way that sectors will be defined under MTSS will be different from what is in the Chart of Account. The sectors are defined in the MTSS in economic terms, so putting together MDAs that do similar things and putting them together and call them sectors. So when you say agric sector, for example, it comprises of all MDAs that are doing things that are related to agriculture. The same thing with education, the same thing with health, the same thing with all other sectors that are defined in the MTSS. Unlike the one in the National Chart of Account, which are so broad. So when you say social sector, for example, I mean, it comprises things like education, health, and so on and so forth, which really the MDAs are not doing similar things. But there is a way, like Chris said, there is a way of mapping the information in the MTSS into the National Chart of Account, because you can then put all the sectors that are defined as belonging to social sector in the National Chart of Account. You can then put them together and say this is for the social sector. So that is one of the things that you come across when you start developing the MTSS. So State Development Plan and MTSS. The State Development Plan contains broad goals, priorities, outcomes, and targets. For those of us that are familiar with goals, state development plans, you see that all what you have there are very broad things, broad goals, broad priorities, broad outcomes, broad targets. It will be almost impossible to implement all these broad priorities or broad goals without sector strategies. So the MTSS does 3 things in relation to the state development plan. The first thing it does is to take the broad aspirations in the state development plan and break them down into implementable components. which then comes to sector level. Second thing it does is that it develops strategies for implementing those broad aspirations, broad strategies. And the third is that it costs the strategies to give a budget idea. It then put cost on the projects, activities, programs that are in the MTSS, and this gives a kind of sector budget idea. In other words, MTSS operationalizes the state development plan. Next slide. So what is MTSS? MTSS represents medium-term expenditure estimates that are linked to clearly defined sector objectives that are derived from overall state goals as defined in the state development plan. If you look at this definition, it comprises at least three key elements. The first thing is that MTSS is an expenditure estimate. It's an estimate of the expenditure that a sector plans to undertake. The second thing is that these expenditures were just not developed, but they were linked to clearly defined sector objectives. Sectors will have their objectives, their priorities. So these expenditures are clearly linked to those objectives. And the third is that the objectives of the sectors themselves were derived from the overall state goals. And the overall state goals will be specified, will be stated or articulated in the state development plan, such that you then see that these expenditures estimate that we're talking about, they actually derive from the state development plan, which set out the priorities of the state government. Also, the MTSS aims at allocating resources to priority state programs within the constraint implied by the overall fiscal targets over a 3-year period. This is just an extension of the definition. And simply what this one says is that the expenditure estimate that is in the MTSS must be made within the constraint that is implied by the available resources. Chris was talking when he was discussing MTEF, especially the medium-term fiscal framework, about revenue estimate. So the revenue estimate for the state defines the maximum amount of money that is available to the state, and all the expenditures that the MTSS they are going to propose must remain within this limit. And it must be over a 3-year period. Again, like Chris explained, there are a number of projects that were sent beyond 1 year, either the fiscal element of them or the recurrent element. So the projections of the expenditure must be over a 3-year period. Next slide, please. So why are state development plan and MTSS so important? Why are they so important? Now, the state development plan is developing a comprehensive medium-term budget process requires a policy framework to be in place. That is the state development plan, which is regularly updated. So there must be a policy framework that will guide the expenditures that we are doing. Otherwise, as we may remember, in the past, we just do budget without any reference to any plan, without reference to any sector strategy, without anything. Actually, what we used to do then was called incremental budgeting, which where you just say, okay, what was your budget last year? The budget was 10 billion. Okay, what do you want it to be this year? Let us add 20%. So our budget for next year is going to be 12 billion without any reference to any priority, any framework, policy framework, and whatever. So the preparation of state development plan actually prevents this from happening because it sets out the policy framework of the state government. As mentioned previously, the state development plan is a collective articulation of government policies and broad strategies. Therefore, the overarching basis for MTSS and resource allocation. They also constitute, the state development plan constitutes the basis for the MTSS. When each sector, by the time you start developing MTSS in Adamawa State, you must make sure that the MTSS for each sector are derived from the state development plan. So the sector objectives must derive from the goals that are in the state development plan. So, the MTSS is of critical importance because it enables effective implementation of the state development plan. As I've talked about this before, that it operationalizes the state development plan. It ensures that government expenditures reflect government priorities as articulated in the state development plan. In other words, it makes budgeting policy-based and meaningful. So it makes the budget that you come up with, it makes them policy-based, and therefore it makes budgeting meaningful. Unlike the incremental budgeting that I referred to earlier on, you know. So when you derive your budget from the MTSS, the MTSS is derived from the state development plan and so on and so forth. You see that the budget becomes meaningful because it is policy-based. It also promotes transparency and accountability in government expenditure. The way it does this is because MTSS, in preparing MTSS, you don't just say, okay, I'm going to implement this project and I'm going to spend this amount of money. But you must also state what output that project is going to deliver. What outcome is going to come out from there. And you must set targets. So these targets are things that you'll be held accountable with and say, okay, at the end of the day, by the time the money, the amount you have budgeted has been made available to you, somebody will then come and say, okay, this money has been made available to you. You say you want to implement this project, you want to produce this output, you want to deliver this. Where is the output? So that is how it promotes accountability. It also facilitates monitoring and evaluation and performance assessment of government expenditure, which again comes out from the specification of outputs and output targets. So, ideally, any project that is not in MTSS should not be admitted into the budget. So if you start, by the time you start developing the MTSS, you must exercise discipline to ensure that if a project is not in the MTSS, it should not be admitted into the budget. Next slide, please. Summary of the MTSS development process. The MTSS development process is fairly lengthy and complex somehow, but we can just categorize the key activities into about 6. The first is to gain clear understanding of government's policies and aspirations as contained in the state development plan. That's the starting point. What are the government priorities? These priorities, like we said, will be stated in the state development plan. And like Chris said, some of the government priorities may come from some political statement. It may come from the manifesto of this campaign manifesto of the governor, for example. What were the things that the governor promised to deliver to the people? This becomes part of the government priorities. So the first thing is to get a good understanding of these priorities. Then you now set medium-term sector objectives. You then set objectives based on these priorities. And then the objective will then be broken down into programs, because you don't implement objective. What you implement is programs. So you then take you break the objective down into programs. Details of how this will be done will be discussed by the time you study the MTSS. But the programs and the objectives, like I said previously, must be linked to the state development plan. They must come from the state development plan, or they must come from wherever the priorities of government have been articulated, like the manifesto, campaign manifesto, for example. And thirdly, the next thing is then to identify the key projects that will need to be executed to achieve the set objective. By the time you have developed objective and you have broken down the objective into programs, then the next thing is to now develop the specific project that will be implemented, under each program. Next slide, please. Then the fourth is to now cost each project. You then cost the project. By the time you cost the project, you then phase them over a medium-term period. The medium-term period is 3 years. So you phase the project cost over 3 years. Again, like I said, Chris already mentioned, there are many projects which you cannot complete within 1 year. So you will have to break the cost over the 3 years. Even with over 3 years, there are some projects that are so big that you may not even be able to complete in 3 years. But you will have to break those costs down over the 3 years and leave the rest for the outer years. But in doing this, you have to bear in mind the indicative ceiling of the sector. In the course of preparing the MTSS, the sector will have been given a certain budget ceiling. I say, okay, education, your total expenditure for 2021 budget should not exceed 30 billion. So everything that the education is going to do must be within those 30 billion. So if they come up with expenditure that is beyond 30 billion, then we'll say that their MTSS is not feasible. It's not feasible because there will not be resources to implement such MTSS. So the fifth key activity will be to define the outputs and outcomes to be delivered to stakeholders in clear, measurable terms. This is what I referred to earlier on, which I said promotes accountability. Then the final one is to agree how performance will be monitored and reported to stakeholders. Next slide, please. Well, before the question and answer, let me just conclude by saying that, okay, this briefly is an overview of the MTSS. But like I said, the MTSS is a fairly lengthy process and it's also fairly complex. But it's something that is worth doing, The ideal time to start MTSS development is around May, So you start around May, and by the time you do it for May, June, July, you'll be finishing around July before the budgeting process actually starts. We are now in August. It's already getting too late now for 2021 MTSS to be developed. So I think the best that can be done by Adamawa this year is probably to try their hands on one sector to see how this thing is done. Thank you very much. Any questions, answers? Both on this overview of the MTSS and the overview of the MTEF that Chris presented. Thank you very much.
I think, let me make a suggestion. I'm not sure whether the PS is having technical challenges. We have one more presentation. My suggestion is that if people have questions whilst I'm making this next presentation, which will be fairly brief, they can type their questions into the chat box as I'm presenting. And then once we reach the end of this presentation, we will open up to answer any questions on the presentation we've just done and the one I'm about to do.
All right, then. Thanks, proceed.
Are we happy with that? Sorry.
Yes, I think we can proceed because I saw PS mute herself. Okay, thank you, Chris.
Okay, PS, anybody, if you want to speak at any point, please feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, put something into the chat box. We want to make this as interactive as we can. We're all new to this digital environment. It's obviously a lot easier if we are all face-to-face in the same room to be able to interact, but we need to make sure that we do it through the digital media. So please feel free to interrupt. So we're now going to look at some key considerations. As I referenced earlier, obviously COVID-19 has been the big thing in the last 4 to 5 months that has impacted not only on 2020 budget and the 2020 budget revisions, but it will also impact into the medium term. So first of all, some top-down considerations. So thinking about aggregate revenue estimates, aggregate expenditure estimates. So what are the recent trends? We have now what's called stagflation. This is similar to what we saw in 2016 to 2017 in the previous global economic crisis. So stagflation, as we call it, is where we have negative real GDP growth combined with inflation. Again, as we saw in 2016, we've also experienced a depreciation of the naira. Now, the GDP figures for Q2 have not yet been released, and it will be interesting to see at the national level how much the economy has been impacted by COVID-19. Will it be as bad as it was in 2016, or will there have been some more resilience in the economy? The impact of COVID-19 specifically on the mineral sector. So we obviously saw the sharp decline in crude oil prices. At one stage, Bonnie Light was selling for somewhere around $10 a barrel. There are also stories about crude oil being sold for negative prices. If we can comprehend that, it's quite difficult to, but that was the extent of the issue. But there has been quite a quick rebound. Crude oil is now trading in the range $40 to $45 per barrel, so quite a significant bounce back, but obviously nowhere near the levels we saw this time last year, and particularly pre-2016 crash. There's been a small reduction in the OPEC quota for Nigeria, so our production will not be achieving the 2 to 2.2 million barrels per day that we've seen previously. And as I mentioned, we have exchange rate devaluation, so the naira devalued the official rate from 305 to 360. I think it's now actually out to 380. Obviously, this impacts on revenues, particularly through the Federation account, but we've not seen the level of drop-off in revenues this time round as we saw in 2016. Again, the removal of the fuel subsidy has helped reduce cost burden to NNPC, which means that more revenue is available for distribution. Let's have a quick look at what this means from a graphical perspective. So on the left-hand side, the left-hand graph shows real GDP growth, which is the blue line at the bottom, and consumer price inflation, which is the gray line at the top. And what we can see is in 2016, we had this sharp divergence, which is not a good thing. So our inflation spiked and our GDP went into negative for 5 consecutive quarters. As we came into recovery in 2018, they came together again, or came closer. We came back to positive real GDP growth, and inflation came down to around 11%. But now we're having that slight divergence again. As I mentioned, we haven't yet got Q2 national real GDP data. That will come out very soon, and we will see what the impact has been in the period April to June this year. On the exchange rate side, again, we've seen the phases of devaluations. We had a devaluation in late 2014. We had another one in mid 2016, and then earlier this year in March we've had another devaluation. The orange line here is the benchmark. This fairly easily summarizes where we're at. A lot of the cause of the devaluations is this gray line, which is our foreign reserves. As crude oil prices drop, so does our incoming foreign exchange, and that causes a problem because there's an over demand compared to supply, and therefore the exchange reserves drop, and it leads to a depreciation. You'll see that over the last year, until the IMF bailout, the IMF rapid financing instrument gave us a 3.4 billion boost, but there was a fairly consistent downhill trend, and that unfortunately is likely to continue into the future. Mineral sector, again, we have the big drop in crude oil prices in 2015 and 16, and then we have a steady recovery but a sharp decline from February this year, and a bit of a rebound. So We're at about $40 per barrel at the moment, but our benchmark is down to 28. Crude oil production on the right-hand graph, again, orange is the benchmark. You'll see that we've been, the gray and blue lines are data from NNPC and the US Energy Administration. They show that we have been consistently underproducing compared to our benchmark. And then our benchmark is now down, I believe, to around 1.8 to 1.9 million barrels per day. So we have to take that into consideration because it will obviously impact our statutory allocation. As I mentioned, the actual distributions from the Federation account to states have been fairly resolute. This is, on the right-hand side is where we are at the moment. In the middle, where you see a big dip, is what happened in early 2016. So you'll see that this is the aggregate monthly distribution to states. We were under 100 billion per month for several months in 2016, whereas we haven't dipped below 150 billion per month. That's the total for VAT, for statutory allocation, and for other distributions to states in a single month. So we're still fairly resolute. We're still above 150 compared to where we were in 2016. So this shows some resilience within our revenues. Now let's look at specifically forecasting Federation account revenues. And this slide is just a bit of a word of warning. You may have experienced when you did your revision to your 2020 budget, if you interacted with the Governors Forum, they would have provided you two sets of estimates for statutory allocation and VAT. They would have provided you an estimate based on the federal MTEF, and they would have provided you an estimate based on their forecasts, which are in line with what Pearl is advising states. And the forecasts by NGF are a lot lower than what federal government is saying. Federal government often refers to its budget or its revenue budget as targets. And what you can see here in this table is that they very rarely achieve their targets. So in 2017, the total Federation account revenues that flowed into federal government, so this is what went to federal government alone, compared to their budget, they only received 67.8%, which means they significantly overestimated. There was an improvement in 2018. They achieved 78%. However, in 2019, their budget for Federation account revenues for crude oil, for companies' income tax, customs, and VAT, they only achieved not 53% of their budget, which means their budget was unrealistic. So generally, we would advise states to be very cautious about adopting the federal MTEF as the basis for their own state level estimates. Youssef referenced earlier a number of states that Pearl has been supporting and previously the Spark program. These states all adopt their own independent estimates of Federation account revenues. They do not take the federal MTEF as given. They do their own estimates. And you'll see that their budget performance, their aggregate revenue outturn, is significantly better than federal government's. So you just have to consider this when you're doing your budget and your MTEF. So how, if Adamawa State is going to forecast its Federation account revenues itself, how is it going to do that? The macroeconomic and crude oil forecasts and indicators that we looked at in previous slides will have a direct impact on statutory allocation and VAT. We promote an elasticity-based forecasting model, which basically means as the assumptions change, as crude oil price outlook changes, that will impact your revenue estimates into the future. The key indicators are the national real GDP growth and inflation. These will have a very strong impact on the company's income tax and the VAT, which make up Federation account. The foreign exchange rate, crude oil price benchmark, production benchmark, and mineral ratio, which I'll talk about in the next slide, all impact the level of revenue that you get from crude oil as part of the statutory allocation. So the models and the advice we give to states is that you forecast the underlying revenue. So you forecast the aggregate crude oil revenues, the company's income tax, the customs, and the VAT in aggregate at the national level. And then you use the sharing ratio, so the vertical and then the horizontal sharing ratios, to derive an estimate for Adamawa State for the 3-year period under the MTEF. Please, as I'm going through, don't forget to ask any questions in the chat box. We can then answer these as we finish the presentation. So I've used a term, the mineral ratio. This may be a term you're familiar with or maybe not familiar with. So it's a very important concept. And it effectively says, for every barrel of oil that is sold or produced and then sold and then converted, the sales proceeds are converted into Naira. This is your aggregate crude oil sales revenue. You could call it your crude oil GDP. It is the financial value of a barrel of oil in Naira. Now, before this flows into the Federation account, there are a number of costs, deductions, other things, which mean that if we sell a barrel of oil for $100, we don't see $100 flow into the Federation account. We will see significantly less because there are production costs, there are the profits of the oil companies. Previously, there was the fuel subsidy, there are NNPC costs, etc. And typically what we've seen in recent years is that this mineral ratio is around 30%. So if you sell a barrel of oil for $100, typically at the end of the day, what flows into the Federation account for distribution across the 3 tiers as part of statutory allocation and derivation is 30% of the aggregate crude oil sales revenue. So the last point, I meant to ask you a question, I've already given you the answer. It's around 30%. Now, let's look at the federal MTEF assumptions and forecasts for, we're just going to concentrate here on the year 2021. And again, this is where I come back to this issue of targets rather than budgets and the realism and the potential for federal government to be overestimating its revenues from Federation account. So the 6 assumptions, the 6 items that we talked about in one of the previous slides that define or help forecast the Federation account revenues, we start with crude oil price. So the federal 2021 to 2023 MTEF has a crude oil price of $40 per barrel. That seems reasonable. So this column here is what we are suggesting. The US Energy Information Administration, which provides forecast for crude oil, is looking at around $50 for 2021. So this $40 benchmark is allowing a 20% buffer. Crude oil production seems reasonable. It's consistent with the OPEC quotas and what is being produced at the moment. Again, exchange rate is based on the current exchange rate. There are some slight differences. This 11.95% for inflation and 3% for real GDP growth. This is what is in the federal MTEF. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in its World Economic Outlook documents, forecasts slightly higher inflation and slightly lower real GDP growth. So to this point, we're largely consistent. There are no major issues. The problem is when we come to the mineral ratio, which we discussed on the last slide. As I said, recent trend is the mineral ratio is averaging around 30%. Now, federal government's budget, although they don't use the concept of the mineral ratio explicitly within their budget, they have an underlying oil and gas model. The aggregate estimates imply a mineral ratio of around 48%, which is significantly higher and has not been achieved within the data period that I have in the last 15 years. So what this means is that the federal MTEF's mineral revenue estimate of 4.7 trillion is probably around 50% too high, and an estimate of around 3.1 trillion is more prudent and more realistic. Within the non-mineral revenues, the company's income tax, the customs and excise, and the VAT, there's limited difference. Again, these are driven more by our macroeconomic indicators, our inflation and real GDP growth. So there are some small differences, but not significant. In aggregate, what this means is that federal government's MTEF for 2021 to 2023 gives an aggregate statutory allocation pool estimate of 6.675 trillion. So that's the total that would be shared across the 3 tiers. Whereas what is more realistic, what is more likely to come, is about 5 billion. Again, VAT is very similar. Derivation, which is unfortunately not something that Adamawa State will enjoy, is obviously also slightly overestimated because of this crude oil mineral ratio. So this just lays out where we think 2021 will end up compared to where federal government thinks it will. So moving beyond statutory allocation and VAT, what are some other considerations for 2021? To what extent has COVID-19 impacted on the state economy? Lockdowns, infections, has it impacted the economy, and therefore will it impact IGR? Is Adamawa State anticipating selling any major assets, housing, other assets in 2021? Is there a market for this? Can individual firms afford to buy housing at this point? That's got to be considered. SIFTAS grants. So we've had the 2018 APA. We will now, I think, already be doing the 2019 APA, and then we have the new DLIs that have been introduced, including the DLI for the adjustment of the 2020 budget. So what can Adamawa State anticipate to get from the SIFTAS grants in 2021? And also, will they get any disbursements in late 2020 that will provide an opening balance for the 2021 budget? Debt sustainability analysis is very important, particularly if you're looking at significant new borrowing. You need to ensure that you do not break through the prudent solvency and liquidity ratios that are defined by Debt Management Office. And then finally, identifying and taking advantage of other sources of financing, grants, conditional grants. It's very important that if there are conditional grants, for which SIFTAS is actually one, it's important that we ensure we are complying with the conditionalities, that we are assigning specific actions and responsibilities to ensure that we can actually draw down these funds. It's very, very important in this time of fiscal crunch. On the expenditure side, we need to ensure that we are continuing to pay salaries, pensions and gratuities, and look to clear any arrears in these areas. This is very important from a social aspect, and also it has great benefits to the state economy. If we get into salary arrears, it means that people are unable to buy food, buy goods and services. So it's very important that we continue to pay our salaries. Using the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis, and our debt stock to identify our debt servicing costs. This is very important. Also identifying any debts, any moratoriums or debt service holidays that we have managed to negotiate with our lenders. The 2020 budget revisions would have seen, I imagine, a number of capital projects removed from the budget. Other capital projects will likely have less funding than originally anticipated, so we are quite likely to see a significant carry forward into 2021. And we need to make sure that our allocations to sectors and to MDAs reflect this carry forward, and also make appropriate provisions for the social sectors, the social sector MDAs, to support COVID-19. Some key engagement points We're very keen, and I think most states are very keen to ensure that they are consultative and engaged with stakeholders. So engagement with taxpayers, both individuals and businesses, ensure that you are not taxing businesses out of business, provide reasonable tax breaks or delays in payment of taxes where businesses are struggling. Communicate with lenders. If you are unable to service existing debts, make sure that you communicate with lenders and tell them that, so you don't incur any unnecessary penalties. And also look at potential new sources of loans, ensure that they are still available. Don't assume loans that you are not able to draw down. As I said previously, identify other sources of financing, both internally, externally, from development partners, from individuals, from as many sources as you can. Finally, ensure that there is sufficient time in the budget preparation process that you're currently going through. You have a restricted time period because of the time spent adjusting 2020 budgets. You are probably late in starting the 2021 budget preparation process. So your calendar will be compressed. The time period to prepare the 2021 budget is compressed, but make sure you include sufficient time to provide consultative sessions with external stakeholders. Some key risks: second wave, resurgence of COVID-19, and that's either globally or in Nigeria. Both will have an impact on crude oil prices, on the local and the state economy. They'll also potentially require additional health and social care expenditure. And then potentially further depreciation of the Naira. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we've seen that the foreign reserves are starting to drop again. There is potential for further devaluation. This will impact potentially inflation and costs of goods and services. Some other considerations: I've already talked about the limited time for preparation of the 2020 budget. The next point, budget classification. So very importantly, in order to be eligible for the CIFTAS 2020 APA, the annual performance assessment, you must ensure that your 2021 budget complies with the 3 segments of the National Chart of Accounts, the administrative, economic and functional segments of the National Chart of Accounts. So the budget has to be presented based on those 3 segments. Otherwise, if you don't fulfill the eligibility criteria for the 2020 APA, you will not be able to draw any of the disbursement linked indicators. Lastly, as we've mentioned previously, identify significant fiscal risks, mitigate, monitor and react as necessary. Final slide. So we're obviously having this session today. This is a practical session. We are fairly tight on time. There are a number of tools that are available that can support states, both through the Pearl program and also through the CIFTAS program. A list of them is on here. We would encourage Adamawa State to engage through its CIFTAS focal officer with the Nigerian Governors Forum to draw on their TA resource, particularly around the 2021 budget preparation, but other areas. There are Pearl tools which are being launched through a number of events and have already been launched. Your local Pearl team will be able to provide you more information on these. So without further ado, let's move to any questions and answers. I'm conscious that we are now 2 hours into a 3-hour session. We started quite late. We haven't actually got into the nitty-gritty of the 2021 to 2023 MTEF, which we want to do. So let's now pause for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. This is wonderful. Rilwan, I think the PS has a question down there on the chat. Can you support?
Okay, go ahead, Rilwan.
Okay, the question is, the federal government benchmark is always referred to by the SIFTAS project. If federal government benchmark is not used, then you lose the fund to be appropriated to the state, PS budget, Adamawa State.
Okay, I'll give an initial answer. Maybe Chidi Berry will also add to this. My understanding from the SIFTAS requirements for the 2020 budget revisions is that there are two elements. There are the benchmarks, and then there are the actual forecast for statutory allocation. So there was a bar, if you like, or an upper limit to your estimation for statutory allocation, which was based on the federal MTEF. So if you included an estimate for statutory allocation that was higher than what is implied by the federal MTEF, you would not be eligible for that DLI. The benchmarks, there was no requirement to be exactly the same as federal government. What you had to do is provide justification for your benchmarks. In my presentation, let me just quickly flip back to my presentation very quickly. I'll show you that there's only one area which is not explicitly contained within the federal MTEF, it's implied. There's one item where there's a big risk, which is this mineral ratio. So as I said, federal government's budget is premised on 48% mineral ratio, or if you look at the revenues they expect from federation accounts, they are based on 48% mineral ratio, whereas what is being observed is 32%. So there's no problem with the rest of these assumptions. The oil price, production, exchange rate, inflation, and real GDP growth are all okay. It's this figure here which is the problem, and this is not an explicit benchmark within the federal budget. It's implied, but it is used when we support states. We do use these figures, so you can be consistent with the overall assumptions but still have a lower aggregate revenue estimate because you include a lower mineral ratio. I don't know, Chidi, if you want to add to that.
Thank you very much, Chris, for responding to that. I'm not sure Mr. Chidi wants to add anything to what you have said. The floor is open now. If you have any other question, we should please go ahead and ask. We can ask by signifying using the raise hand button, or you can put it in the chat box and we can pick it up from there.
Sorry, Rilwan.
Yeah, I'm listening. I'm with you.
I think Basil wants to talk.
Okay, Basil, please. You have the floor.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Hello? Can you hear me?
Good morning, Oga Basil.
Can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I wanted to contribute to what Chris said. Essentially, it's not that those macroeconomic assumptions that are different from the mineral ratio, like the inflation rate, the GDP growth rate. It's not that your own should be exact with the federal government own, but that your assumption will lead you to a realistic statutory allocation, what you are expecting to receive from the federal government back, should not be above, that is what the SIFTAS is saying, should not be above what the federal government is projecting for you. So it could either be within that range exactly, or below it. So the MTEF was giving states the lower benchmark, which was derived by the MTEF, and the higher benchmark that they use the federal government assumptions or criterion to arrive at. So there is no, like Chris said, there is nothing that says that you cannot have assumptions that are different from the federal government assumptions. But it must be realistic. That is the key word. It must be realistic and lead you to a fact expectation that is realistic, that is within that the threshold. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Basil, for adding a voice to that. In the absence of in the absence of any other question, I think, Mr. Chris, we can proceed to the next presentation.
Thanks, Elwan. And okay.
Sorry, Yusuf. No, go ahead.
Oh yeah. Just to confirm, if PS is satisfied with the responses, I can see one chat coming in. Oh, it's from Chris. All right. Maybe silent means PS is satisfied. We can proceed. Yes, I am. She is. Thank you, PS, for responding, for the prompt response. Let's proceed. Thank you, Chris.
She okay, if she is, because we have unmuted her, she can talk if she likes.
Okay.
But she has typed our response anyway, so.
I think what I mean, just more general advice. Again, I know states will be, maybe nervous is not the right word, but keen to ensure that they do everything that they need to comply with the CIFTAS requirements. So I think in any of these instances, please do refer to NGF, to us, by writing. However, if you've got any concerns, we all want you to achieve as many of the DLIs and obviously critically the eligibility criteria. So if there's ever any doubts in anything that you're doing, please do refer back to us. Everybody wants the states to draw as much money as they can. The World Bank, us, NGF, it's in everybody's interests that the states get as much money as they can. So please, as I said, if you're ever in doubt, don't hesitate to ask a question. And if you're doubting anything that we're saying, please do challenge us. We see the documentation. We are very closely communicating with NGF. So if there's anything you are worried about or concerned about, don't hesitate to raise it. So the next item in the agenda is to look at what the MTEF or the top-down MTEF document looks like. We've got an example document from a fictitious Wazobia state. Now, this is going to take about 15 minutes to run through this document, which will take us up till, let's say, close to 12:30. And then we only have half an hour left in this session based on the original timeframes. So what I really want to try to get is some feedback from the Adamawa state government officials. Firstly, whereabouts are you in your annual budget process? I've seen the call circular, but I've not looked at it in detail, so I don't know when budget submissions are due for MDAs. In terms of the MTEF for this year, really you want to have an aggregate revenue estimate that can be used as the basis for your bilateral discussions. As Dr. Gabriel said, it's unlikely you're going to do a significant number of MTSSs this year because the time period is too late. So what I'm trying to get to is what do we look to achieve in the last hour of this session today, and can we potentially set up or convene a follow-up session sometime early next week to actually go through the practical aspects of doing your fiscal framework and your budget framework. So we can just take the time today to complete the presentations, and we can allow ourselves sufficient time to go through the actual practical session in detail. I really would like to get feedback from people on that before we continue. So if anyone has any responses to that, they can either unmute, they can put a response in the chat box. We'll give you a few seconds to do that. If I don't hear back, then I will continue with the overview of the top-down MTEF document. The other option is that we run over slightly today and allow ourselves more time, but I'm really looking for some indication from our colleagues from Adamawa State as to what are your preferences. Perhaps the PS or the chairman of the FRC, Director Budget, if somebody able to respond.
Sorry, Chris, I just want to update on some people. One, Mr. Joseph Charles Dakara. I think he has a question, but he can't talk because his network is not stable. There is no mic. I just want to make this announcement that Mala Abbas Abdullah Lamurde, Mr. Joseph Charles Dakara, Mr. Maxwell Tadawus Wamanda, and the Director Planning himself, Mr. Tobayame, you can't talk because your network is unstable, it's not showing mic. You can kindly log out and log in again. Maybe it will be stable, then you will have mic icons so that it will allow you maybe to talk if you have questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think, as I said, if we're really struggling to actually get feedback from the state and interact, it's from the Adamawa colleagues, the practical session will not work, because otherwise it will be me making decisions, which is and putting in assumptions and no interaction. So I think if networks are not sufficient today, I think we just continue with the next two items, which is the overview of the document and the overview of the forecasting template, and then the last kind of main item on the agenda, which is the actually preparing the fiscal framework. We have to postpone that and do it in another session, because it will not work if we cannot interact. So okay, I think somebody is trying to speak. Okay, so please, if I've asked a number of questions, I've made some suggestions. If anybody wants to interrupt me and respond on those, please do so either through the chat box or by unmuting and making comments. In the absence of any comments, I'm just going to proceed as I suggest. We will look at the top-down MTEF document.
Hello, please.
Yes.
Let me draw us back a little. When can we get the state get the process well?
We can't hear you. Who's speaking?
How do we get the toolkit mentions in the way of making this project? The toolkit mentions, toolkit.
Say it loudly. We can't hear you.
Why do we get the toolkit mentions in the last program? Slide, please. For this project.
We will make all of.
Hello?
Sorry, I think I heard the question. We will make the presentations available. This session is being recorded as well. We will give you the link to the recording, so you will have all of the materials from this session immediately that we finished.
Okay, it's okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so I am going to proceed again. Please interrupt me by text, by microphone, but I'm going to proceed on the basis that I have suggested. As I noted, we are, if you look at my screen, we have reached this point. We've just finished this item here. We're now moving on to this. What I'm suggesting is that given the time, we have 45 minutes left. We concentrate on these two items, and that this item here is shifted to another follow-up session. We try to ensure that networks are better during that session. So again, I'm going to proceed on this basis unless I get any feedback from anybody. So this is an example document. It's called the Economic and Fiscal Update, the Fiscal Strategy Paper, and Budget Policy Statement. This effectively covers the top-down elements, the first two elements of the MTEF, which are the fiscal framework and the budget framework. So this is just an example to show you the text that and the format and the structure of the document that you would prepare. Now, before we start going through the document, what I will say is that given the time frames, this year we would not propose to prepare this entire document. We would probably propose to prepare just the fiscal strategy paper element. So we would abridge or not do this, and we would abridge potentially or not do this. This is the most important thing given the time frame. So when we're going through this document, just bear that in mind. We'll make this example document available to you as well. So we have 5 main sections. Sections 2, 3, and 4 are as per the title of the document. So the Economic and Fiscal Update, the Fiscal Strategy Paper, and the Budget Policy Statement. We have at the beginning an introduction and background, and at the end we have a set of key recommendations and key points. So we have our lists of tables, our lists of abbreviations. Again, this document should be made available to civil society, to external stakeholders. These people may not be so familiar with all of the terms that us PFM professionals use on a day-to-day basis. So for example, IGR or FAC, the average citizen on the street may not know what they are. So it's very important that we include abbreviations. The first section is the introduction and background. It again is providing a bit of information for people who are not overly familiar on the process. And again, here we see the diagram that we saw in one of our presentations, which is what the MTEF is, our aggregate resource envelope, signified by a circle, and then that is split into sector allocations, and then subsequently at a sector level that is split into programs. So again, this just provides the reader with some background as to the content of the document. We talk about what is in the document and who has prepared it. And then we provide, again, background for the readers on the legislative and institutional arrangements for public financial management in Adamawa State, or in this example, Wazobia State. So these are all things that are fairly static on a year-by-year basis. They are not the most important parts of the document, but they are useful background reading for the stakeholders. And finally, we provide a copy of the budget calendar. This document is one of the first documents that is published, prepared and published in the annual budget cycle. So it's a good place to have a copy of the budget calendar, so that can also be shared broadly and externally. Now we get into the first main section, the economic and fiscal update. And this is broken down into its two constituent parts. We have first an economic update, and then we have a fiscal update. So the economic update looks at three levels. It looks globally because of the crude oil price and impact of the global economy on crude oil prices and demand. We are obliged really to look at what is going on in the global economy. I think I can see a question. Okay, let's increase size. Okay, so we look at the global economy. We look at some statistics, some GDP statistics from some countries that might be relevant to Nigeria. So some of the G7, some of the BRICS and other countries. We also look at what is happening globally in terms of inflation. Then we drill down to the African economy. We provide some narrative on what is happening in the African economy. Then at the third level, the Nigerian economy, because what is happening in the broader Nigerian economy will impact Adamawa state. We look at the macroeconomics. We look at the crude oil prices, petroleum sector, just to provide us some background as what has happened over the last 5 years. And then finally, again, this is an example for Wazobia states. So in this section, you would look at what is actually happening in the Adamawa state economy. Do you have GDP and inflation estimates or statistics from historical years? What is the trend in the economy? So that's our economic update. And again, it's all background context. What has been happening? What has been the journey over the last 4 to 5 years that helps to inform where we go in the future. Then we have our fiscal update. And what the fiscal update does is it looks at our key revenue and expenditure items and identifies the trend and how we've performed against budget. So for each of your main items of revenue and expenditure, you would produce a graph that looks a little bit like this. And this shows blue original budget and red actual performance over the last 6 years. So what we can see here is the trend in statutory allocation for Wazobia state is an upward trend, and budget performance has generally been strong. In fact, we've only had 2 years where budget performance has been lower than the budget. This gives us very important information as to whether, as a state, we've been historically overestimating or underestimating our revenues and expenditures. And again, as I've mentioned previously, when we produce these documents, any documents that are of a financial nature, it's very important that we don't just produce a set of figures or a set of graphs. We also have to provide the written analysis, justification, basis for forecasts. And in this instance, we have to describe what has been happening, what has caused this trend, and what has caused the budget performance. So we include under each graph a narrative description of what has happened and why. So you'll see that we have this for each of the main items: excess crude, VAT, IGR, grants, other capital receipts, loans, and then we move on to the expenditure side. So this example is from several years ago. We wouldn't expect to see CRF charges anymore. They are captured within the specific overhead items. Personnel, again, same graphs, but different data. So again, we see here, blue is actual budget, original budget, red is actual. And again, for each graph, we provide our written analysis. And this written analysis helps both the readers, but also those people preparing the MTEF to understand what has been happening. So we have overhead expenditure, we have capital expenditure. And then we look at our recurrent and capital expenditure ratio. Blue is budget, pink is actual. Have we been over or underestimating our capital expenditure ratio? We then look at expenditure by sector. What we want to see is where have we been spending our money on a sector basis historically, and which sectors have enjoyed better expenditure performance than others. And what we typically see in a number of states, I don't know the Adamawa state figures very well, but from other states we see that certain sectors typically enjoy high rates of budget execution, and other sectors typically see lower rates of budget execution. It typically is the economic and administrative sectors that see more, and the social sectors that see less. And we can see this in tabular format. So what we can see, and this is just an example. So what we can see in this example, you may not be able to read, you'll see the document. We can see average performance over a 1, 2, 3, 4-year period. So education sector, average performance of 62%, whereas we have another sector here, rural and community development, has an average performance of 144%. So, and we can see the average budget allocations. We can see where we've been allocating our money, which defines the policy priorities of government. Again, we'll send you this draft document. You'll be able to review this in your own time. This economic and fiscal update is something we wouldn't propose to do in detail this year because of the time frame involved. The last part of the economic and fiscal update is the debt position. So I've talked previously about the need to do a comprehensive debt sustainability analysis. This should really be undertaken on an annual basis. Here we just have a brief overview of the debt position, particularly the solvency ratios and then the liquidity ratios. And we have a set of thresholds and where the state is at the moment. And this provides a good guide as to whether a state is able to run fiscal deficits and draw down more borrowing, or whether they should actually be looking to run a budget surplus and repay existing debts. The second or the third section is the fiscal strategy paper itself. So this is what we would be concentrating on doing this year. So this is the most important section when we're considering Adamawa State's 2021 to 2023 MTEF. So we start with the macroeconomic framework. As I said, there are a number of factors which are very important because they help us forecast our particularly federation account revenues. And the macroeconomic framework should contain at least these items: the exchange rate, the benchmarks for crude oil, and the national inflation and GDP growth. If you have state level data as well, state inflation, state GDP growth, these should also be included. If not, they shouldn't. We then should define our fiscal policy statement and our fiscal strategy. So here we include some items such as targeting to grow IGR by minimum 10% per annum. As we know from CIFTAS, there are some CIFTAS DLIs which reward states for IGR growth at certain percentages. So maybe Adamawa State would be targeting to achieve those DLI, the basic or stretch targets. Will Adamawa State allow a contingency reserve? Will there be a planning reserve? Will you be targeting any ratios in terms of your capital expenditure ratio? Will you be targeting 50% capital expenditure or more than 50%? These are the kind of things which will help actually define the figures in the fiscal framework. And then we come to the figures themselves. So these are generated from the Excel spreadsheet that we will look at next. and they are presented similar to how you would present your annual budget summary. So we first start with recurrent revenues, and then we have recurrent expenditures, and the balance from this recurrent part of the budget is transferred to the capital account. We then have our capital receipts, any reserves we set up, so potentially contingency and planning reserve, and then we have our capital expenditure, and finally our financing, our borrowing. So this is the typical structure of the medium-term fiscal framework. We will obviously adjust it to there's new definitions of recurrent expenditures under the National Chart of Accounts, so we adjust for this, and we'll see that in the Excel that we look at next, an up-to-date version of this table. Then, again, as I've said on a number of occasions, the MTEF and more broadly the budget, the accounts, they are not just figures, they're not just tables of figures like this. The figures need to be explained, justified. What was your basis for forecasting statutory allocation? What were your assumptions? So here we include a narrative for each of the items in the fiscal framework. So statutory allocation, VAT, etc., etc. And then on to the expenditure side, personnel, overheads, reserves. So this is really what we want to get out of, if we'd had the time today, if we'd started as scheduled and we did the practical session, this is what we'd want to do really, is to use the Excel to generate this table and to provide narrative on the assumptions. And this table would help then inform your aggregate annual budget for 2021. Some graphs, some fiscal trend graphs, which show where we've been and then where we're going to in our forecasts. And then finally, in this fiscal strategy paper section, our fiscal risks. Again, these will be common across a number of states. Reliance on continued distribution of excess crude, security, elections, which is not relevant at the moment, but there are a number of risks which, again, these are potentially political, economic, environmental, security, any risks which will have a material impact on revenue or expenditure. So they could have something that decreases your revenue, you could have something that increases your expenditure. If there are significant unknowns that could cause those scenarios, we need to define them and describe what we will do to help stop them happening, or if they do happen, what we will do as a reaction. The fourth section is the budget policy statement. So in the budget policy statement, we basically need to define our priorities in terms of sectors, where we will be spending our money, the priorities that were laid out potentially also in the State Development Plan and the government's manifesto. And these will help then also define actual allocations. So if you remember, we had our pie diagram. If I just scroll back up, this table here is the pie, the big round pie. And then what we do is we divide the pie up by sector. So here we have literally the same type diagram. This is our aggregate budget size, and we are going to allocate 40% of it to infrastructure. We're going to give 15% to education. You may not be able to see these, it's quite dark text. 10% to health, etc., etc. And here we actually have those in figures. So these would be the envelopes. These would be the basis for the MDA envelopes, either issued through the budget call circular or as the basis for the bilateral negotiations. And in this version, we've done a ceiling for aggregate recurrent expenditure, and we've done a ceiling for capital expenditure. It may be that you would just want to issue capital ceilings or ceilings for overhead and capitals or other classifications of expenditure. And you can see here in this example for Wazobia State, if you go back to the presentation by myself and Dr. Gabriel in the first presentation, we talked about sectors. Sectors are more than just the 5 sectors as contained in the National Chart of Accounts. They are the sectors based on your MDAs, based on your based on how you will prepare your strategies. So here in this example, we have 14 sectors. These would each come under one of the 5 sectors per the National Chart of Accounts. Again, it's very important that these allocations, these sector allocations, are then used in the annual budget process, as I said, either through the core circular or through the bilateral defence. So really here, this section or subsection, we describe how we're going to ensure that that happens, and any other considerations that may also be included in the core circular. For example, here, priority must be given to ongoing projects. So that's something that we have identified that in this document. Maybe we have a fairly small capital development fund for the year, and therefore when we issue our budget core circular, we should tell MDAs that they shouldn't be introducing new projects. They should first, as a priority, be completing ongoing projects. And lastly, a summary of key points and recommendations. So this is almost an executive summary, but at the end of the document, it just is a final thing for the reader to consider as they conclude the document. So we've been through this fairly quickly. This is a very comprehensive example. This is a document that would take a couple of weeks of dedicated time from a team within Adamawa State to produce. In this year's instance, given the time constraints, we would just be recommending that you concentrate on the fiscal strategy paper section and largely the macroeconomic framework and assumptions, fiscal strategies, policy statements and targets, the indicative fiscal framework itself, the figures, the numbers, and the assumptions and justifications for those numbers. So that is the main element of what we would want to support on this year, and in subsequent years we can consider looking at a broader, more comprehensive document. Okay, that's the end of that run through. As I said, we will provide you this as an example document. You will probably also be able to see other states will have published this document online. You'll be able to see examples from other states if you look at their state websites. It's also a similar structure, similar content to what you would see in the federal MTEF. Okay, I will pause for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, and see if we get any questions, any comments, any interactions with colleagues from Adamawa State Government.
Thank you, Chris. I think it's like most of the Adamawa officials have been having internet challenge up to now, which makes the interaction maybe make it very difficult for us too. I think at some point we have to reschedule this to another date so that we can go into the interactive session with all of them getting prepared, even if it means they maybe assemble in a certain in a location they feel like will be much more, the internet connection may be much more stronger. Otherwise, we will not be able to do the practical session. This is my own suggestion. And I will be reaching out to the PS and the executive chairman to see if what date they will give us.
First of all, let me apologize. we've been having serious technical issues here, and that's why the program started a bit late. But however, we've been able to follow up as far as the interaction has been conducted. And I would invite one of our technical people from planning to comment on the documents that you've just gone through. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Just hold on. No, you need the mic to listen. Okay. So that the rest can hear what you're asking. Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Ask what?
No, just go. Just speak.
What I did. Hello?
Hello?
Uh-huh.
Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah, the interaction was fine. Our major problem here is that most of the what do you call it? The government federation allocation. They don't reach us very early. So sometimes we go through papers and other things to find them. So we will be very happy if this can be sent to us on time so that we can start our fiscal strategy paper very early.
Thank you very much, sir. What's the name, sir, and the designation?
I'm George Shah from Adamawa State Planning Commission.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. George. This designation. You are all, sir.
Deputy Director PPP.
Oh, that's good. I think before the facilitators respond, really quick from, it's like, I think you will get some of these things from the Accountant General office because they do have the monthly files, the meeting files. Well, what do you think, Chris, Chidibere and Basil? This you can respond to him as well.
So what it would be good to find out is where Adamawa State are with the 2021 budget preparation calendar. We appreciate this is late. Ordinarily, states would be preparing these documents, the MTEF, in May to June. Obviously, we know that this year we have been held up by the COVID-19 budgetary adjustments, which took until late July. In the first year of producing an MTEF, there is quite a significant requirement to collate historical data. As I said earlier, Adamawa State has done very well to collate that and has done a very comprehensive job. So we are trying to support and move ahead to prepare this fiscal strategy paper, part of the MTEF, to inform the 2021 budget. If we can get it done through a couple of practical sessions over the next week or so, and it can be completed before your budget submissions from MDAs, and I think we've done a good job for this year. That would be my suggested target. We will share with you all of the documents and all of the presentations that we've made today. We will also share a link so you can actually watch a video of the session. So the whole session has been recorded, so you can run through it at your leisure. That's my response for now.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate that.
I think I like this suggestion, and I think it will work for us if we can have an agreement where technical sessions could be agreed and the documents made available, so that we will have a go-through before we have these technical sessions. It will be of some good help. Thank you.
Okay, so my suggestion is there's one more session I said we should try to do today in the next 15 minutes, which is just so I can give you an overview of the spreadsheet that we had shared with you previously, that you put your historical data in, because that will be what we will go through largely in a practical session. So again, because we're recording this,
okay,
you'll be able to then watch this back. So if we just take the last 15 minutes of the plan. Sorry, I've been muted.
Okay. Okay.
My suggestion is we run through the Excel spreadsheet, the overview. I'll give you an overview of the Excel spreadsheet that you've previously put your data into. Because we're recording this session, then before we do the practical, the follow-up, you can watch this video back through, you will refresh your minds, you will be able to look at the overview of this Excel template, and then we can go straight into the technical sessions, into the practical sessions, at a point where, where we've corrected these connectivity issues.
Okay, very well. I think it will work for us as well.
Okay, so without further ado, let me just go through this last session. I will share my screen again, and then I will hand back over to the Northeast team to just conclude. So let's move on with that.
Yeah, very well.
So this is the Excel workbook that I sent you previously, into which you entered all your historical data. We will just run through this workbook. I will show you the various worksheets. And as I said, you can then watch this back at your leisure, and then we will be working through this document to actually prepare your fiscal frameworks in a follow-up session. What we have, just the structure of a Microsoft Excel workbook, we have a number of worksheets. So these, if you see these tabs along the bottom, these are all worksheets within an overall workbook. The first worksheet we see is what's called menu and calibration. And what this also includes is basically the steps for completing the document. So very simply, at the top we have the year, the current year, which defines the year that we're covering in the MTEF, which in the year 2020 we would be preparing the MTEF for 2021 to 2023. Then we have some specifics around the state and its sharing, the fact sharing ratios, and I'll show you in the practical session how we obtain these. But we have the state share of statutory allocation pool. As I said, unfortunately, Adamawa does not enjoy derivation, so this is not relevant. And we have the state share of VAT. Then if states share any of their IGR with local government, we have the percentage here. And that's important because this spreadsheet also provides forecasts for local government councils for their federation account and any IGR that the state shares with them. And finally, we'll ignore this one for now, but when we go into the forecasting, you'll see that we can use some in-year estimates for revenue and expenditure to support forecasting. Then it goes on to show the steps, and there are hyperlinks in here. So if we click on one of these, it will take us to the point in the spreadsheet where we actually do this step. So the steps, we've done the first step, provide historical, fiscal, macroeconomic, and debt data. And then we have the process of basically preparing our fiscal update. We have the process of preparing our fiscal strategy paper and our budget policy statement. We may also want to prepare an executive summary of this document. So this is the document we looked at previously. Our economic and fiscal update is drawn from this. Our fiscal strategy paper is drawn from this spreadsheet, as is our budget policy statement. Now, as I said, these are all hyperlinks. So the first stage is your historical data. And this worksheet here is where you were putting all your data. And the cells highlighted blue define what data is needed, what period of data is needed for. Again, you did a very good job of filling in all of your revenue and expenditure performance data. And if we're forecasting into 2021 to 2023, we want data going back to 2014. That's 6 years of actuals and 7 years of budgets. That's how much data we need to forecast. So you have provided your historical revenue data, original budget and actual, and your expenditure data, original budget and actual. We've also got our national GDP. I think these state GDPs are, maybe I'm not sure where they come from. Your debt position, some of the underlying federation account revenues. Again, we need this for forecasting. And then there's the option to provide sector level expenditure. If you remember in the document we looked at previously, we also had summaries of how expenditure was allocated and actually spent on a sector basis. So this is the historical data. Just in terms of order, we're going to flick through the spreadsheet. I'm going to flick across now to the historical performance graphs. Now, with your data, the spreadsheet has already generated all of these historical performance graphs. So similar to what we saw in the document, we can see our budget and actuals for statutory allocation. And then for derivation is not relevant, so this can be ignored. For VAT, and here again, a case in point, what we can see historically for Adamawa State is that you have quite often overestimated your VAT. So in 2015, 2016, 2018 and 2019, your budget has been quite high compared to your actuals. You can see here the trend in VAT has been a fairly gradual growth, whereas you have in some years expected quite significant allocation. So that tells you that potentially when you do your forecast in this MTEF period, you maybe want to be slightly more prudent with your VAT forecasts. Okay, flicking back, we can now look at the fiscal framework itself. Again, this is familiar. This is similar to what we saw in the document itself. So we have a macroeconomic framework, and we have to put in our assumptions into the macroeconomic framework. For the inflation, we may hide these rows if we don't have state level estimates into the future. We may hide these. And then we have our crude oil assumptions and our mineral ratio, very importantly. And then we have all of our revenue and expenditure items by the major classifications as per the NCOA. So we have statutory allocation. We will hide this row net derivation. We don't need to see it. There's no estimate. VAT, IGR, excess crude. Then we go through the major classifications of expenditure as per the NCOA, personnel, social contributions and benefits, overhead, grants, contributions and subsidies, and public debt. And for each of these items, we have a number of different ways of forecasting: elasticities, moving averages, or we can use our own percentage or our own value. We will go through these in more detail in the practical session. So this helps us to define our recurrent expenditure and revenue budget. We then, as we move through the worksheets, we go to capital receipts. So in the capital receipts, we will define, or we will outline our anticipation for internal and external grants, internal and external loans, and any other capital receipts. And for each item, we will indicate whether it is discretional or non-discretional. So if it's discretional, that means we can spend it on anything. So for example, SIFDAS is a discretional grant. You don't have to, you're encouraged to spend it at the moment on COVID response, but you are free to spend it on whatever you want. Whereas something like a World Bank FADAMA or one of the other World Bank sector programs, they'll loan you money, but you're obliged to spend it in a specific sector. So in here, we define whether our capital receipts are discretional or non-discretional. And once we have this, this will flow back into our macroeconomic framework in our capital receipts and our financing. And then we will have our capital expenditure budget. We may want to include reserves, a contingency reserve and or a planning reserve, and they may be based on our total revenue budget or our capital expenditure budget. So we will go through the process of defining our, or preparing our macroeconomic assumptions and choosing our forecasting, how we're going to forecast these items, and then list all of our grants and our loans and our other capital receipts. So these are things that you can start, particularly these capital receipts, are things you can start to think about before we actually have the practical session. So what typically I would advise a state to do is look at what grants it has in its current 2020 budget, and to consider which ones will also be available in 2021, 2022 and 2023, and then think about additional items that may be coming online in those years, and do that for each of your grants, internal, external, your loans, and any other capital receipts. So you can start to think about that in advance. So that will get us to a fiscal framework. We will have to justify that. We will have to write about our assumptions, why we've used certain forecasting techniques. That is the narrative that is contained within the fiscal strategy paper. So once we have this, we have the cake. If you remember the cake diagram, the pie, this defines the pie, and then we come across to our envelopes. So we would potentially, at the moment we haven't filled in this data historically, but we have options to allocate personnel expenditure. We see in this, we would have historical allocations and actual expenditure by sector. We have a tab for personnel, we have a tab for overhead, and we have a tab for capital expenditure. So again, in this instance, in this iteration of this document, we may not do these sector level allocations, or we may do it. We will discuss that in the practical session. Last two items, we have debt. So this is our solvency and liquidity ratios. So this is populated with your data. So what you can see is you're actually quite high in some of these ratios. Your total domestic debt to IGR is quite significantly higher than the recommended threshold. Whereas on your external debt, you are not too bad. It's within the ratio of external debt to total revenue. So this should guide you in terms of your decision making for what you can afford to borrow over the period 2021 to 2023. Finally, the last worksheet is the local government allocation. So we would need to list all of your local governments in here. And similarly to how we looked at the horizontal sharing ratios for Adamawa State, we can, and I'll show you this in the practical session, we can identify the sharing ratios for your local government councils. So based on the assumptions you put in your budget, in your fiscal strategy paper, you will be able to communicate to local government councils the anticipated statutory allocation and VAT that they can anticipate in the next 3 years. This is quite important because I know a number of states rely on or jointly fund projects, particularly road projects, with local governments, or perhaps the state would build one of the primary roads and the local governments would do the tertiary roads. But it is important that states and local governments are conversing and coordinated in their budget preparation process, and each one knows what the other is doing, what the other can afford to contribute, what they can't afford to contribute. This applies, more broadly to the MTEF, to the sector strategies. There will be elements of the sector strategy that the state, that Adamawa would expect its local governments to dovetail with or directly supply. So that interaction is very, very important. It's potentially worth having Ministry of Local Government as a stakeholder and a participant in the MTEF working group, so that they can be the conduit between the state government, or maybe the Planning Commission has this role. I'm not sure exactly the dynamics in Adamawa State. So that is an overview of this document. There are other worksheets I've not shown you, but they are less important. As I say, you can walk through the process through this first menu and calibration worksheet. You can walk through the process of preparing this document and preparing the broader MTEF. So as you re-watch this video, please at least re-watch this last 15 minutes of presentation before we have our next session, because the next session that we have, we will go into the detail of actually going through these steps. As I said, we've done the first step, we've done the historical data. We now need to go through the remaining steps. We may miss off some of these, we may not do our fiscal update, but we certainly need to do everything in here. Everything in fiscal strategy paper is what we're going to concentrate on in the next session. We'll also provide you with some documentation. We'll provide you with a guide to actually using this spreadsheet that you can refer to again in advance of the next session. So I'm going to stop there. We are almost exactly 1 o'clock, a few seconds after 1 o'clock. So I will now hand back to the Northeast team, the Pearl Northeast team. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat box. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. We sincerely appreciate you for this wonderful presentation, which is actually will be helpful to Adamawa in realizing their dreams in terms of budget realism. And I think the next thing is to liaise with Adamawa State government officials and agree on when we will reconvene for the practical session, and by then to also see that maybe to look for a conducive environment where they will have internet connections without disruptions, and to proceed with the next engagement, which we are aiming to, if possible, maybe I don't want to preempt, to say, do you think next week, maybe before reaching out to them, may I maybe request, maybe may I request you to maybe suggest a date that is free for you next week, to see if that is if they are comfortable with the date, then we can communicate by tomorrow, so that people will be.
Why not we do that after this thing? Let's look at our schedule, then agree time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chidibere. All right, that's fine. That's fine.
Another suggestion I might want to make in terms of resolving these technical connection challenges, they could decide to go to a hotel that has Wi-Fi, good Wi-fi. They can stay there and log in and during the session, during the practical session, because they can't do it without a strong internet.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Thank you, sir.
It will be, I think it will be advisable during the practical session for individuals to have their own machines or whatever, because I mean, I don't think the group work like they have today will be very suitable for the practical session anyway. So yes, that's why they can go to a location, maybe a hotel or an event place that has strong internet. All of them can stay there and use their own machine. Yes.
Okay, we'll communicate. If the executive chairman is listening, I think we will take up that with him
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, we are in a hotel. We are sitting in a hotel conference hall. Unfortunately, the Wi-Fi here seems to be acting up, and some of the.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
He said that you are in a hotel. Yes, I was hearing him. Anyway, so.
Okay. I was saying we are actually in a hotel conference hall. Actually, can you hear me?
Yes. Mr. Andrew, can you?
Yes, you have to. People have to switch off their mics. I think there are a lot of people trying to talk. Yes.
Oh.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
Very well. I was saying that we are in a hotel conference hall. Unfortunately, the equipment that is here and the internet connection is a bit sufficient. However, we have taken your observation and we will try and arrange for a better venue with better communication next time when we agree on a date for the next interactive session.
Can I ask quickly, whilst we do have the connection, I'm looking at your original budget call circular, and it gave a deadline of 5th of August for MDA submissions. Have they complied with that? When do you start bilateral negotiations?
I think, Chris, this is the call circular they sent is that of 2020 budget.
Okay, right, okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just looking at that. So has the call circular been issued for 2021? If so, what is the deadline for MDA submissions, and what are the planned dates for the bilaterals?
Yes, I think maybe the PS Planning Commission, if she is listening, or the executive chair will tell us, because I understand that they already issued out the call circulars. They are about to start the bilateral discussion. Okay.
Hello?
George?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you, sir.
Yes.
Okay, our call cycle has not been sent out yet, but it will be going out very soon.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. So that means that's good.
Will you issue ceilings? You said perhaps we can just send an email with a few questions proposing a date for the next session, and just ask a few questions. We can share the materials from today's session, including the link to the video. We can propose a follow-up, and we can just ask them to give us a quick update in an email of where they are. As I said, what I'm keen to know is, 1, what date they will issue the call circular, 2, what date they will expect MDA submissions to be made, 3, when will they start bilateral discussions, and 4, are they planning to issue ceilings in the call circular, and if so, for what?
Okay, Chris, this is noted. I will follow up to get the information.
Yes.
Hello, Chris. Hello, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe in line with what you are saying, it might be good that we just, develop a checklist for them.
I think that's what she is.
That could help them, guide them in the steps. That also enable them to know if they are following the proper sequencing
Yeah, I'll also ask about the NCOA as well, because that's the other very important consideration for this year.
Okay. Thank you.
Chris, I think what you guys can do for us, it will be nice. We will send a checklist, and you guys can look at our checklist, and then if you require any additional information from us, we would gladly oblige.
Okay, I'll prepare that and I'll send it out to you by tomorrow latest.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And
so I think, Yusuf, unless we have any other comments, I think we've agreed next
no,
steps.
just to thank, yeah. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, over to you, Yusuf. No, it's yours. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. And at this point, I would like to thank each and everyone for participating in this event. And I think the next step has been covered, where we will reach out to Adamawa to get more about their budget and the status of their 2021 budget process, and also agree on dates to reconvene for the practical session. And except if anyone has something to add, that's otherwise we will close the session until when we meet next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you all. And thanks
All right.
everyone for trying
Thanks,
to stay in, even though the connections were bad. We've got a lot of participants still online. So thank you everyone. And we look forward to having a more interactive session next time around. If you've got any recommendations around the delivery, how we presented, please do feed them back. We're all learning in this process. This new digital age of online communications is still new to all of us. We're not necessarily the experts, so please feed back as well after this session. Thank you.